So one of the big influences for me was the whole cybernetic idea of the intelligent machine, but not intelligence in this human sense, more intelligence in the animal sense. And so a classic example of this kind of thinking comes from Edward Echanowitz, who in the 1970s created this magnificent work called the Sensor, which was an analog computer that had properties that you would associate with living things, such as an animal. It looked a little bit like a giraffe, but it was all done through analog computing. And it had some microphones and sensors in the front. It would follow people around. It would watch and observe them and respond to them in a way that wasn't necessarily intelligent in the sense that we would think about human intelligence as having a conversation or intelligently responding, but the way that we might think of a foreign or alien intelligence. Another area that's always fascinated humans is the idea of game playing. So the classic example, of course, being the mechanical Turk. People may be familiar with this. It was a chess-playing machine, supposedly a machine that was taken around Europe in the 18th century and fooled people into thinking that someone had made a machine that was clever enough to play chess. It turned out that there was a very good chess player inside the machine who was actually quite small and could fit in inside and not be seen. But the whole concept of game playing and the idea of a machine beating humans at the best most intellectually demanding game that they could play chess has occupied people for a very long time. And one of the ideas that came from the cybernetic era that's very important is this paper by Ross Ashby, who was one of the leading cyberneticians in the 1950s. He wrote it in the British Journal of Philosophy in the early 1950s. He said, can a mechanical chess player outplay its designer? And this question has really fascinated me throughout my professional career and all the work that I've done. Can we design things that are greater than us, that can do things that we never expected or anticipated or designed into them? So one system that we know is capable of doing this is nature. So biological evolution has evolved millions of different successful designs, if you like, without the concept of a designer. It's in biology what's known as non-teleological design. There's no necessarily purpose or designer behind them, and yet these incredible designs that are functional, and we might also find them aesthetic, emerge. So one of the ways that I think about using the computer in this sense to create designs that outperform myself as the designer of the systems is a reconceptualization from using the computer as a tool to using the computer as part of an environment, an ecosystem. So when this work, Eden, which I'll come to in a minute, was made, which was in the early 2000s, myself and a group of colleagues were involved in research into the idea of using biological evolution, it was much more in the sense of the interconnectedness of nature in terms of feedback systems and the way that complex ecosystems have many dependencies, symbiosis, mutualism, parasitism, and so on. So we thought about this concept of embedding the computer in a physical environment and using sensors on the environment that included the noise in the room or the interactions of people, and for that computer to become part of an electronic ecosystem that interacts with people. So the other big important influences for me was being Australian and having access to some really beautiful, pristine areas of nature. Was the influence of this national park. It's called Lynchfield National Park. It's in the Northern Territory of Australia, and I spent a couple of weeks just camped out very remotely in the bush. So I basically just sat around all day in this very beautiful environment, watching things like ants and the way that they behaved and went about their work of collecting dead insects and things. And as I flew back home, I started thinking, looking down from the aeroplane as I was flying back to where I live, of the Indigenous Australian representation of land and stories. This is a very famous Indigenous Australian painting. So all of these things inspired me to create something that was not necessarily mimicking any of these things, but had its own particular kind of life. So this work, Eden, as I said, it was developed in the early 2000s, and it's a very simple two-dimensional world. It consists of three things: solid rocks that are impenetrable, what you might consider to be flowers or food, which is biomass, and these animals, very simple animals like ants, you can think of them, that have a very simple artificial intelligence. And so the first version of the work was purely a computer simulation. So you can see here, this is a shot from the year 2000 when I first wrote the software. But what I observed in the system was something very interesting, that the creatures over time, because they had a learning mechanism and they evolved, actually started to learn things about their environment and modify their behaviour based on conditions that occurred in their environment. So for example, they would learn to hibernate in the winter. The simulation had 4 seasons, just like in the real world, and in the winter it was better to survive by hibernating because there was very little food and it was cold than it was to move around because that cost more energy. So when the spring came and the flowers started to bloom again, the creatures would move around and start getting very frenetic and active to try and get as much food as they can before the next winter came on. One of the areas that I've always been very interested in is the relationship between the digital and the physical. So how to bring a completely enclosed digital world into the physical world so it has some kind of symbiotic relationship with the human audience. There are 2 screens that are translucent with a projected version of this 2-dimensional evolving world, and there's a fog machine, several speakers, and the computer that's driving the whole simulation. The most important thing that I want to draw your attention to is there's a camera above the system, and that's watching people in the space. So the idea with the work is that the creatures in the virtual simulation can hear sounds and they can make sounds. The sounds that you hear in the room are the sounds that the creatures are making, and they can also hear the sounds that other creatures are making. They don't have the same perception of sound as we do, but like we do, they can hear sound and they can make sound. The presence of a person in the space generates food for the system. So over time, the creatures learn that by making interesting sounds, that they can keep people in the space for longer, therefore increase their chances of survival and reproduction. The whole idea of merging these 2 spaces together is not just one that's done visually, it's also done conceptually, because there's a symbiotic relationship develops between the human audience and the virtual creatures in the space. If no one is in the space for long enough, everything dies and the world becomes quite barren. And there's lots of food in there. The creatures have no need to make any noise or to move around very much. They just sit there grazing like cattle. So there's very little that happens. But then if people are away for too long, the food disappears, they start moving around and making noise to try and draw people back into the space. The whole idea of artificial creatures perceiving an environment, for me, was the key thing about this work, because they're perceiving something beyond their electronic world. They have no knowledge of people in the space. They don't know what a person is, and yet they have this symbiotic relationship with people. They need people in order to survive, and somehow through evolution they learn that by enacting certain behaviours, that increases their survival, which I think does challenge that whole dictum of Descartes that a human design can outperform the expectations of the designer. So I certainly never imagined that would happen when I wrote the simulation.
O labirinto, que é uma representação memorial, arquetípica, de percursos intrincados, míticos, imaginários ou reais. Desde os anos 70, foi uma imagem e uma configuração recorrente em meu trabalho, em formato solo ou conjugada com outras imagens, para remeter a diferentes significados. Os labirintos são espaços novelados e difíceis de percorrer, mas neles não há múltiplas opções em busca de uma saída. Infinities é sobre uma experiência que podemos sentir quando estivermos capturados ou totalmente encurralados num labirinto que não termina, no qual as paredes alcançam o nosso peito e aparentemente se estendem até o horizonte, em todas as direções. E dentro dessas paredes, o usuário se sente como dentro de um lago ou de um mar de água rasa, sem ilha, sem terra à vista. A experiência proposta em Infinities inclui variações e movimentos. 5 diferentes configurações emergem e submergem de um chão também totalmente preto e infinito, onde fica o interator. Existe um som específico, feito com teremim, e para quando as paredes estão totalmente em cima e embaixo. Quando o visitante pode, então, caminhar e andar através dos labirintos até que as paredes começam a submergir de novo. O outro trabalho é a Odisseia, que é um ambiente imersivo de realidade virtual e que começou com meus estudos, minhas prospecções sobre o hipercubo e os possíveis deslocamentos dentro desse espaço pluridimensional, onde não há gravidade e onde, desde o início, imaginei corredores do tipo caminho de formiga, que havia que atravessar. Essas são as primeiras prospecções em que eu investigava como, dentro de um cubo, se pudesse andar sem gravidade dentro desses caminhos. Aqui as cores ajudavam a perceber como podia me deslocar sem gravidade dentro desses caminhos, já pensados assim, dentro de um cubo quadriculado, com uma malha perspectiva, né? Nos primeiros esquetes e modelos, eu investigava umas narrativas visuais em que os motivos para os participantes se deslocarem dentro do cubo eram bastante aflitivos. umas marcas de mãos gigantes que apareciam nos corredores, mas imediatamente eu fui desistindo disso e cheguei à narrativa que agora eu proponho dentro de um projeto técnico que foi mostrando gradualmente a necessidade de usar o poder de processamento proporcionado pela conexão com Stuttgart. A aplicação desses algoritmos, as possibilidades de uma narrativa que constantemente muda os acessos e os corredores desse cubo-nave aí, responde pelas características que acreditamos que são em si indagações sobre a consciência e decisões autônomas de computadores. Odisseia agora propõe uma jornada sem retorno, ambientada em um céu diurno, aberto, infinito, onde um grande cubo opera como nave espacial transparente, com entradas e saídas em cada face, uma disponibilidade alternada de caminhos. Odisseia pretende ser a experiência de uma passagem física e, ao mesmo tempo, subjetiva, pelo interior de um espaço vítreo e labiríntico, onde é possível caminhar sem gravidade em direção às possíveis saídas do cubo-nave. Finalmente, a condição de não poder voltar aos espaços já percorridos, que antes era causada pelos padrões gráficos invasivos, agora está concebida como situação causada pelos próprios participantes, cujos passos trituram, quebram e esfacelam as superfícies transparentes, que subdividem os espaços interiores dos labirintos percorridos até a saída que leva os participantes de volta ao céu, sempre entrevisto através da quadrícula que recobre tudo. Não haverá outra alternativa que seguir adiante, pois voltar atrás será ficar em suspenso, uma suspensão inquietante, assim, no interior do grande invólucro transparente e vazio, onde permanecem apenas fragmentos dos corredores quebrados. Odisseia é, de fato, é um jogo imersivo, simples, mas acho que é difícil. Entrar no cubo, cruzar o labirinto e encontrar a saída para o céu.
The next work is called Meta Google, and it's a work in which I'm talking about our relationship with today's digital images proliferation. And to do so, I'm confronting William Burroughs' heritage with the Google, which is for me the symbol of today global soft capitalistic companies. Let me start by William Burroughs. He's a writer. He's belonging to the Beat Generation movement, like Jack Kerouac and Ginsberg. And I believe, for me, he's one of the most influential writers and most influential artists in the 20th century. And specifically because he developed a lot of experimental writing, and when he was using randomness and chance. And I've been inspired by his work for many years, and because I believe it's really much today's digital practice. And he's especially famous for the usage of the cut-up. And I don't know if you're familiar with the cut-up technique. Actually, it was invented by the guy on the right, which is Brian Gysin. He's an artist. And I put that pictures because Brian Gysin is famous for inventing the dream machine that we have there. And talking about, because we talked today about consciousness, this is a very good example of consciousness. It's a machine that actually flickers lights in relationship with your brain waves. And they create visual image, but the visual image you can only see when you close your eyes. And that's really, it's very interesting in an historical landmark in terms of art and consciousness. So the cut-up, to go back to the cut-up, was invented by Brian Gysin, but it's actually William Burroughs that took it to a broad level. And William Burroughs used the cut-up to destructure the language in order to create a new language. So that was the point. It was to create a new language that was free from the normal conventional structure. And it took it to a certain point that actually he wrote novels like The Soft Machine, Nova Express, The Ticket That Exploded. And that's actually kind of remarkable because using randomness in creative writing, you can find example in the Dadaists, you can find example with the Surrealists, or even the French poet Stéphane Mallarmé. They were using this kind of random creative technique, but that was to build poetry. That guy there, he used nonlinear and randomness to create stories. back to Google. I mean, I'm not a digital native. I saw the internet coming up in the 90s, and we all saw it as, we thought it would have been a great utopian way to change the world. And 25 years after, it turned out to be, well, there are some good things, but it turned out to be an infrastructure for mass surveillance, as we know since the Snowden revelation. Or it's an infrastructure to send out fake news and manipulate election, like we saw in the US with the election of Donald Trump. So there is, we move from an utopian vision to a world that looked like more and more what William Burroughs described in his book, a kind of controlled, manipulated systems. Out of that, Google is the crystallization of this growing skepticism we have toward the digital future. I mean, the Google company is everywhere in our life, and they are, it's a profit-driven company. They pay very little tax. They do not contribute to our education system, do not contribute to our healthcare system, and still they are more and more involved into changing our future, our life. They are involved in many, many developments with AI, biotech, big data. In the end, may change the dramatic nature of our human mankind. So I'm actually questioning this cryptic issue by using Google in my creative process. And for years, I've been doing a simple search, which is Google. And I've been doing this for years. I've been doing this in many languages. And every month, I basically download, like a vacuum cleaner, 100,000 of images. At the beginning, it was more like an ironic kind of a position, you know, like a feedback technique or a mirror technique to Google. And it turns out actually I've been quite attracted by the image I found. There is a set of images that are obvious, like, you know, all the Google marketing material, the logo, the product, the glasses, and so on. But on the other hand, there is also lots of anti-Google images, against the company, against the internet, like off the grid, against the capitalistic movement that Google embody, like Occupy Wall Street. I'm not interested into one image. What I'm interested in is to the combination of the flow of images they create, the kind of a meta-story, meta-image they create, and how they are representative of our a flow of internet images that we are surrounded nowadays. And so I'm using these images with one of my favorite material, which is the lenticular. It's an optical material. I like this material because I can stack on this material big numbers of data, big numbers of images, and that create accidents, that create glitches, that create a kind of fuzziness that for me contrasts the very cold image looking of typical digital images. And also, I like this material because it brought a new way to reading images that are very similar to the way we read digital images. We don't read digital images in the same way we look at conventional images. The gazing is more dynamic. We fall into the images. We are immersed into the images. And that material allowed us to do so. And what I'm doing, I'm actually selecting thousands and thousands of Google images that I'm printing on this material, and I'm sticking to a black metal. And by doing so, I'm erasing the images. When you look at the piece in front, you just see a black monochrome. But then when you walk on the side, you will see some trace, some ghost image of the images. Something that is telling you there is something that is going to disappear, a kind of negative intensity of the scene. It is for me a kind of iconoclastic gesture about talking about there are so much image that actually they lead to a disparition of the images. I do see this proliferation of images leading to a disparition. And for me, that's very, very much linked to the future of artificial intelligence or cybernetic, which at the end of the day, the goal is the death of death. And the death of death may be a good idea, but the fear of death is what makes us human compared to other species, is what allows us to create art, to create imagination, to create religion. And with this development of artificial intelligence, there is a potential disparition of the death, and I'm tackling this issue through disparition of images. And what I'm basically showing there is images that are about to disappear. When you just see a trace, you just see a kind of negative intensity that is passing away. And I'm creating a kind of mirror image that is talking about something that may or is about to disappear.